A weary traveler steps off a long-haul flight, eager to get home, but within minutes, he's singled out, questioned, and detained. What happens next will leave everyone stunned. The terminal at Hartsfield-Jackson buzzed with activity. Families embraced, travelers scrolled through their phones, and flight attendants moved swiftly through the crowd. The low hum of voices mixed with the steady roll of suitcases, filling the air with the rhythm of constant motion. Congressman Jerome Carter sighed as he stepped off the plane, rolling his stiff shoulders. After 2 weeks of back-to-back meetings overseas, he was ready to be home. Washington, D.C. could wait. First, he needed his own bed, his wife's cooking, and a few days of rest before diving back into politics. Dressed in a navy blue suit, crisp white shirt, and polished leather shoes, he carried himself with quiet confidence. A small flag pin rested on his lapel, a subtle yet unmistakable mark of his position. In one hand, he gripped a sleek black briefcase, containing diplomatic reports, a few gifts from foreign dignitaries, and his passport. As he approached customs, he prepared himself for the usual questions. He had done this routine 100 times: hand over his passport, get a nod from the officer, maybe a quick, "Welcome home, sir." Then, he'd be on his way. Except this time, it didn't go that smoothly. "Sir, step over here for a moment," came a firm voice. Jerome turned, his eyes landing on Officer James Larkin, mid-40s, broad-shouldered, with a square jaw and a buzz cut that looked military sharp. His uniform was perfectly pressed, his expression unreadable. Jerome frowned slightly but complied, stepping aside while other passengers breezed through without issue. A young white couple with backpacks gave him a brief glance before hurrying past. An older man in a business suit nodded politely to another officer and was waved on. Larkin gestured toward a checkpoint. Routine screening. Routine. Jerome had heard that word too many times before, always directed at men who looked like him. He handed over his passport, watching as Larkin examined it longer than necessary. The officer's eyes flickered up, scanning Jerome's face as if expecting to find something out of place. "Where are you coming from?" "London," Jerome answered smoothly. Larkin nodded but didn't return the passport. "Purpose of travel?" "Government business." Larkin's brow furrowed. "What kind of government business?" Jerome resisted the urge to sigh. "I'm a U.S. congressman. Diplomatic meetings." Larkin didn't react, as if he hadn't heard him. "Did you bring back any goods?" Jerome motioned to his briefcase. "Just documents and a few diplomatic gifts. All within allowed limits." Still, Larkin didn't move to return the passport. Instead, he tilted his head slightly. "Mind if I take a look?" Jerome hesitated for half a second. He knew his rights, knew this wasn't standard protocol, but making a scene wouldn't help. With measured patience, he unlatched the briefcase, revealing neatly organized files, a leather notebook, and a small, ornate wooden box, a gift from a British official. Larkin picked up the box, turning it over. "What's in here?" Jerome clasped his hands together. "A commemorative pen set. It was given to me as a diplomatic courtesy." Larkin's lips pressed into a thin line. He set the box down and rifled through the rest of the briefcase, lingering over the papers as if he could read them just by touching them. Satisfied, at least for now, he shut the briefcase and looked Jerome in the eye. "Step over to the secondary screening area." A slow wave of tension rolled up Jerome's spine. He had traveled internationally for years, but something about Larkin's tone felt different. More calculated. More targeted. He stole a glance at the other passengers passing through customs. None of them had been stopped like this. Jerome squared his shoulders and let out a steady breath. He knew better than to argue in a place like this. A secondary officer, younger, less sure of himself, motioned toward a glass-walled inspection room. Jerome entered, setting his briefcase on a metal table. Larkin followed, closing the door behind him. "Sir, do you have any undeclared cash over $10,000? Jerome shook his head. "No." Larkin leaned forward slightly. "Do you have any prior arrests?" Jerome felt a flicker of irritation. He met the officer's gaze head-on. "No." Larkin's eyes narrowed, as if trying to read between the lines of a non-existent lie. Jerome exhaled slowly. "Officer, is there a reason I'm being singled out?" Larkin didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached for a clipboard on the table. "Just a standard check, sir." Standard. Routine. Random. The words that never seemed to apply to anyone but people who looked like him. Jerome had spent years in Congress advocating for equality, fighting systemic biases, working to ensure black men weren't disproportionately treated as criminals before they even spoke. And yet, here he was. He could stay quiet. Comply. Let them waste his time, then walk out and pretend this never happened. Or he could push back. His jaw tightened. He wasn't just any traveler. He wasn't some anonymous businessman. He had power to make noise, to demand accountability. Jerome straightened, his voice calm but firm. "I'd like to speak to your supervisor." Larkin's expression flickered, just for a second, before settling back into practiced neutrality. "There's no need for that," he said. Jerome didn't budge. "Then release me." Larkin's fingers tightened around the clipboard. The room was thick with tension, an invisible battle waged between them. Finally, Larkin set the clipboard down and sighed. "Wait here." Jerome watched him go, his pulse steady but his mind racing. He had made his choice. Now, he'd see what came next. Jerome sat at the metal table, his hands resting on its smooth but slightly scratched surface. The room was eerily sterile, white walls, no windows, and a fluorescent light overhead that buzzed just enough to be irritating. A security camera in the corner recorded everything, its small red light blinking in a slow, steady rhythm. The air was thick with tension, the kind that crawled under your skin. Officer James Larkin leaned against the opposite wall, arms crossed, studying Jerome like a puzzle piece that didn't fit. The silence stretched between them, heavy and unspoken. The door behind Larkin remained closed, a reminder that Jerome wasn't free to leave. It wasn't the first time he'd been in an interrogation room. But those times were different. Those times, he'd been there by choice. As a lawmaker. As a policymaker. As a man who fought for justice. This was different. Here, he was the suspect. Larkin flipped through Jerome's passport again, as if something new might suddenly appear. "Long trip, huh?" His voice was calm, but there was something lurking beneath it, something Jerome recognized. Distrust. Jerome met his gaze. "It was." Larkin nodded, still staring at the passport. "And you say you were traveling for government business?" Jerome exhaled sharply. "I didn't say. I stated it. It's a fact." Larkin's lip twitched slightly. "Right." He tapped the passport against his palm before setting it down. "You're carrying a significant amount of cash." Jerome frowned. $2,000 isn't significant. It's well below the reporting threshold. Larkin shrugged. "Seems high for a routine trip." Jerome clenched his jaw, forcing his voice to remain even. "It's standard for international travel, especially for a U.S. official. You're welcome to check the currency declaration forms I've filed over the years. They're public record." Larkin ignored the offer. "You ever been arrested before?" Jerome's fingers curled into a loose fist on the table. He knew this game, knew where it was going. "No," he said evenly. Larkin's eyes narrowed slightly. "Not even as a teenager." Jerome leaned forward slightly. "Not even as a teenager." Larkin tilted his head, letting a slow smirk spread across his face. "That's impressive. Most men in your demographic have at least one run-in with the law." Jerome inhaled sharply, suppressing the anger rising in his chest. He'd heard variations of this before, but hearing it here, under these circumstances, made it hit differently. "I wasn't lucky, officer," he said, voice measured. "I was raised right. I worked hard. And I've dedicated my life to public service." Larkin snorted. "Public service, huh?" He leaned forward, placing his palms on the table. "Tell me, Mr. Jerome," he paused, then added, "or should I say Congressman Jerome, if that's really who you are." Jerome stiffened. "Check the credentials." He gestured toward his ID, which sat on the table beside his passport, his official government identification, his congressional seal, all indisputable proof of his identity. Larkin picked up the ID and examined it, turning it over in his fingers. "You know," he mused, "it's not hard to get a fake ID these days. Even a good one." Jerome's patience snapped. "Call my office." His voice was low but sharp. "Call the State Department. Call the Capitol. Hell, call the White House if you have to. But stop wasting my time." Larkin didn't flinch. If anything, his smirk deepened. "See, here's the thing," he said. "I don't have to do anything. What I can do is hold you here for as long as necessary until I get the answers I need." Jerome's eyes burned with anger. He leaned forward, locking eyes with Larkin. "And what exactly are you trying to find?" The room fell silent. Larkin tapped his fingers on the table. "Just doing my job." Jerome exhaled, shaking his head slightly. "No, officer. You're not just doing your job. You're abusing your authority." Larkin stood up straight. "Watch yourself, Congressman." Jerome's lips pressed together. He knew the power balance here. Knew that no matter how much authority he held in the world outside, in this room, it was different. But he refused to shrink. He sat back, folding his arms. "Let me ask you something, Officer Larkin." His voice was calm, but firm. "If I were a white man in this suit, with this briefcase, carrying this ID, would we still be sitting here?" Larkin's jaw tensed. He said nothing. Jerome leaned in slightly. "Are you detaining me because I'm black?" The room thickened with silence. Even the hum of the fluorescent lights seemed louder. Larkin blinked once, then twice. He licked his lips, glancing at the camera in the corner, as if suddenly remembering it was there. For the first time, Jerome saw a flicker of uncertainty cross the officer's face. Outside the room, a pair of footsteps echoed down the hallway. The muffled sound of a voice, firm, authoritative, grew louder. Larkin's gaze flicked to the door. And in that moment, Jerome knew something was about to change. The door creaked open, and the air in the room seemed to shift. The heavy tension that had settled between Jerome and Officer Larkin was momentarily interrupted by the sharp, purposeful footsteps of the man who entered. He was tall, middle-aged, with salt and pepper hair and a crisp uniform that carried the insignia of higher authority. His nameplate read, Captain Reynolds. His eyes barely skimmed the scene before locking onto Jerome. And the moment recognition dawned on his face, it was as if someone had drained the blood from his body. His posture stiffened. His mouth opened slightly, then shut as if struggling to form words. Then, finally, he spoke. "Congressman Jerome." His voice carried both shock and urgency. "Sir, what are you doing here?" Larkin froze. His smirk disappeared in an instant. His back straightened, but his shoulders tensed as if preparing for impact. Jerome didn't move at first. He just let the weight of those words sink into the air. Let the gravity of the moment settle onto Larkin's shoulders like a boulder. Then, finally, he let out a slow breath and turned toward Captain Reynolds, his voice steady but laced with exhaustion. "I'd like to know the same thing, Captain." Reynolds' jaw clenched. His eyes flickered toward Larkin, then back to Jerome. He already knew, before anyone needed to say it. He knew. He stepped forward, his tone urgent now. "Congressman, I deeply apologize for." Jerome held up a hand. "Save it." His voice was sharp but calm. "What I want is to be released. Immediately." Reynolds didn't hesitate. "Of course. Right away." He turned to Larkin, his expression darkening. "Unlock those cuffs. Now." Larkin swallowed hard. His hands, so confident and steady just minutes ago, now fumbled with the keys. The cuffs clicked open, and Jerome rubbed his wrists, shaking off the weight of the last hour. The room was silent except for the sound of the metal restraints being placed on the table. Jerome stood slowly, rolling his shoulders back, reclaiming his presence. He turned to Larkin, staring him down, not with anger, but with something worse. Disappointment. "This is what you do," Jerome said, his voice low. "You see a black man in a suit, carrying a government ID, and you assume fraud. You detain him like a criminal. Larkin had no response. His eyes darted to Reynolds, as if hoping for some sort of lifeline. But none came. Reynolds' voice was sharp now. "Officer Larkin, I'll be dealing with you after this. Step outside." Larkin hesitated, then gave Jerome one last look, one filled with something between embarrassment and resentment, before walking out, shoulders stiff, jaw clenched. The door shut behind him. Reynolds sighed, rubbing his forehead. "Congressman Jerome, I assure you, this is not how we operate. I take full responsibility for this mistake." Jerome exhaled, gathering himself. His anger was still there, simmering beneath the surface. But something more important had settled in now: resolve. He picked up his passport, ID, and briefcase, looking Reynolds dead in the eye. "You can take responsibility," Jerome said, "but you can't undo what happened." Reynolds swallowed, nodding. He knew Jerome was right. And Jerome? He had work to do. By the time Jerome walked out of the airport, his phone was buzzing. Missed calls. Texts. A voicemail from his chief of staff. The news was spreading. Within hours, it was everywhere. Headlines flashing across the internet, news anchors dissecting the situation on television. Congressman wrongfully detained at airport, profiling or routine check. A U.S. lawmaker held like a criminal. When will it stop? If it can happen to him, it can happen to anyone. Jerome sat in the back of his car, watching the chaos unfold through the screen of his phone. His social media was flooded with messages. Some were from people outraged, offering their support. Others were from individuals sharing their own experiences, stories of being stopped, questioned, harassed, all for simply existing in the wrong place, in the wrong skin. He closed his eyes for a moment. This wasn't just about him. It never was. The chamber was packed. The air was thick with anticipation. Cameras rolled, pens scratched against notepads, and eyes locked onto Jerome as he stood at the podium in the U.S. Capitol. He adjusted the microphone, looked across the room. Then, he spoke. "If this can happen to me, a congressman, a public servant, someone with power and visibility, then what happens to those with no title, no influence, no voice?" A murmur rippled through the crowd. Jerome continued, "I wasn't targeted because I did something wrong. I was targeted because of what I look like. Because somewhere, someone in uniform decided that my presence was suspicious before I even spoke a word." He scanned the room, making sure every single person felt the weight of his words. "This is not just my story. It is the story of countless black men and women who are treated as threats before they are seen as people. And if we do nothing, if we shrug it off, if we move on like this is just another headline, then we are all complicit." A silence so thick it pressed into every inch of the room. Then, applause. It started small but grew, rolling through the chamber in waves. Some stood. Some clapped hesitantly. Some sat still, their expressions unreadable. But no one could deny the truth in his words. Back at the airport, Officer Larkin sat stiffly in a conference room, the same way Jerome had days before. Only this time, he wasn't the one in control. An internal affairs investigator sat across from him, a thick folder on the table between them. "Multiple complaints," the investigator said, flipping through pages. "Patterns of profiling. This isn't an isolated incident, Officer Larkin." Larkin shifted in his chair. "I was doing my job." The investigator leveled him with a stare. "Then why is it always the same type of person being randomly selected?" Larkin had no answer. His badge sat on the table, gleaming under the fluorescent lights. And for the first time, he realized, his power wasn't untouchable. Jerome sat in his office late that night, staring out at the city skyline. His phone buzzed beside him, a message from a young man who had seen his speech. "Thank you for speaking up. I've been stopped like that before. But nobody believed me. Now, they do." Jerome exhaled, setting the phone down. This fight wasn't over. Not by a long shot. But tonight, something had changed. And tomorrow, the work would continue. How many others go through this daily, without cameras, without justice? If this story resonates with you, share your thoughts in the comments. Let's keep this conversation alive.